Mass cannibalism sounds like something from horror stories, not real history, but one medieval winter left behind too many questions and too few answers. The records are quiet, but the rumors never stopped. What happened during those frozen months that no one wanted to write down? And why does the truth still feel too dangerous to say out loud? To understand how things unraveled, we have to start with the year 1315, a year that arrived like any other until the sky stopped cooperating and the ground stopped giving back. What began as spring showers turned into a weather disaster. Rain fell constantly through spring, summer, and fall. Not gentle garden rain, but relentless flooding that destroyed everything. Fields became muddy lakes. Crops rotted in waterlogged soil before they could grow. Mother Nature apparently got stuck on the rain setting and forgot where she put the instruction manual. The previous year's grain supplies were already dangerously low. Medieval people lived season to season, harvest to harvest. When 1315's crops failed completely, families stared at empty storage bins with horror. Storage bins went from pantries to empty reminders of better times. 1316 brought another year of failed harvests. 2 years of crop failure in a row was catastrophically unlucky. Livestock began dying from lack of feed. Farmers went from raising livestock to counting their losses, and the math wasn't looking good. Salt became as precious as gold because constant rain flooded salt mines. Without salt, people couldn't preserve what little meat they had. Everything spoiled quickly in the damp conditions. Crop prices tripled overnight. Wheat and rye became luxury items only the wealthy could afford. A single loaf of bread cost more than most people earned in a week. Bread went from daily staple to weekly salary, and most people couldn't afford either. Constant rain made it impossible to dry anything. Firewood was soaked, grain was moldy, clothes never dried. Roads became impassable mud pits. Entire villages emptied as people abandoned homes to search for food. These wandering groups found the same devastation everywhere. Starvation deaths increased rapidly. As desperation grew, people began eating things that would never normally be considered food. When your stomach starts growling, you might grab a snack from the fridge. But what happens when there's literally nothing left to eat? The people of medieval Europe discovered some truly creative ways to stay alive. Grass became a delicacy. Families crawled around pulling up every blade they could find and boiling it into green mush. Weeds that people normally stepped on suddenly became precious vegetables. The local landscaping went from lawn care to lunch care pretty quickly. Tree bark wasn't just for woodpeckers anymore. People scraped it off with knives, then shredded it into soup. Pine, oak, birch. Suddenly, every tree species had potential as a main course. Trees probably started wishing they could pack up and move to a different forest. Animal bones that had already been picked clean got a second chance. Families crushed them with rocks and boiled the pieces to make weak broth. Even the bones were getting second interviews for the dinner table position. Leather items became emergency food supplies. Belts, boots, and gloves went straight into cooking pots. People boiled leather for hours until it became soft enough to chew. Your wardrobe literally became your menu. Talk about edible fashion statements. Domestic animals that families had raised became survival necessities. Dogs, cats, and rats ended up in cooking pots. Horses were bled regularly, and the blood mixed with whatever grain remained. Some desperate souls collected pigeon droppings and ate them raw. Moss and lichen were scraped from stones. People ate clay and dirt, hoping their bodies might absorb minerals. Children were abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. These weren't picky eaters. These were ordinary people pushed to the absolute edge. The line between food and non-food had disappeared. But even these desperate measures weren't enough for some people who eventually crossed lines that should never be crossed. Court records from this period tell stories that sound impossible. But desperate hunger pushed people past every moral boundary. Medieval legal systems suddenly documented crimes they never imagined they'd need to address. Polish court documents reveal cases where parents cooked and ate their own children. These weren't monsters, but ordinary mothers and fathers driven beyond breaking points by starvation. Judges struggled with how to handle crimes committed by people literally dying of hunger. Family dinners took on a whole new meaning, and not the good kind. German towns saw women executed for secretly feeding human flesh to neighbors. These women thought they were helping their community survive, but discovery led to panic. The neighborhood potluck suddenly needed much stricter ingredient disclosure policies. Some individuals tried selling human flesh disguised as pork in village markets. They convinced unsuspecting customers they were buying normal meat. When authorities discovered the deception, both sellers and buyers faced horror beyond imagination. The local butcher shops suddenly had very questionable quality control standards. Villages across Flanders reported neighbors simply vanishing during harsh winter months. People disappeared without explanation, and no one asked questions because everyone suspected the terrible truth. Missing person reports became pointless when everyone knew the grim answers. Corpses hanging from execution gallows became targets for midnight thieves. People risked their lives to steal bodies left as warnings to criminals. These corpses were taken home and boiled for whatever meat remained. Even the dead couldn't rest in peace when they kept getting dinner invitations. Chronicles from Norway and France documented eating the dead becoming widespread in certain regions. What had once been unthinkable was becoming routine in the most affected areas. Forest roads became hunting grounds where travelers disappeared during winter journeys. Highway robbery took on a much more sinister meaning when robbers weren't after money or valuables. Most cannibalism occurred after families had lost at least one member to starvation. It took 2 full years of watching people die to push communities past their breaking point, but these horrific acts didn't happen randomly. Certain groups of people faced far greater dangers than others. Famine didn't threaten everyone equally. The Great Famine created a brutal hierarchy, where some became predators, others became prey, and a few stayed safe through wealth or luck. Travelers faced the greatest danger because they had no local family to protect them. Strangers passing through villages were easy targets since their absence wouldn't trigger investigations. Being the new person in town went from socially awkward to genuinely life-threatening in record time. Orphan children wandering between communities became especially vulnerable. These kids had no parents to defend them and often begged for food in multiple villages. Old people without relatives found themselves equally endangered. The village welcome wagon suddenly became much more selective about who actually got welcomed. Communities sometimes deliberately sacrificed criminals and debtors to protect valued members. Village leaders made cold calculations about which residents were most expendable. The neighborhood watch programs suddenly became much more selective about who they were actually watching out for. Graveyards turned into hunting grounds as desperate people dug up recently buried bodies. Many villages posted armed guards at cemeteries to prevent grave robbing. The phrase, "rest in peace," became more of a hopeful suggestion than a guarantee. Frozen ground made proper burials impossible, so bodies were left above ground for weeks. These delayed burials created opportunities that starving people couldn't resist. Winter storage took on a completely different meaning when the storage was happening in the graveyard. Some communities developed secret meal-sharing systems where groups took turns providing food without asking questions about its source. Everyone understood the unspoken rules, but nobody discussed them openly. Wealthy townspeople escaped by fleeing to safer regions or bribing officials for hidden food supplies. The rich didn't disappear. They just relocated temporarily to places with better resources. Religious leaders rarely became victims because churches had better food storage and community protection. Having faith was helpful, but having a well-stocked pantry turned out to be even more practical. Remote villages experienced much higher cannibalism rates than cities. Geography often determines who lived and who ended up on someone's dinner plate. While ordinary people struggled with these impossible choices, the powerful institutions that were supposed to protect them had their own response to the crisis. Medieval institutions discovered they were completely unprepared for widespread starvation and social collapse. Every level of authority found their traditional methods utterly useless. Religious leaders responded with spiritual solutions to physical problems. The church organized prayer marathons and proclaimed the disaster was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Priests suggested more fasting and prayer while people were already involuntarily fasting to death. It was like prescribing diet pills to someone who was already starving. Kings learned that royal authority meant nothing when roads were impassable and food didn't exist. Even powerful monarchs couldn't magically create grain or transport supplies over flooded routes. Crown jewels made terrible soup ingredients, and royal proclamations couldn't fill empty stomachs. Turns out, let them eat cake doesn't work when there's no cake to be found anywhere. Many wealthy landowners hoarded grain in private storehouses or sold supplies at outrageous prices, profiting from neighbors' desperation. These decisions created lasting hatred between social classes and proved that feudal loyalty had definite expiration dates. The feudal system suddenly looked more like the fend-for-yourself system. Local lords continued punishing peasants who stole food even during peak starvation. Property rights remained sacred even when people were dying of hunger. Some executed villagers for taking bread that belonged to landlords. Towns hired armed guards to protect food warehouses from desperate citizens. Markets became battlegrounds where hungry crowds fought soldiers protecting grain supplies. Shopping for groceries required military escorts when groceries were more valuable than gold. The institutional response revealed medieval society's complete inability to handle large-scale emergencies. Most people discovered they were abandoned by every system they had trusted. Eventually, the crisis would end, but the scars it left on European society would last for generations. The rain stopped in 1317, but Europe didn't bounce back quickly. The continent had been wounded in ways that would take decades to heal, with some changes becoming permanent features of medieval life. Agricultural recovery moved slowly, even after normal weather returned. Fields needed replanting, livestock required rebuilding, and communities had to relearn abandoned routines. It was like trying to restart a garden after someone had poured concrete over everything and then forgotten where they put the seeds. Hundreds of villages were abandoned forever because too many residents had died or fled. These ghost towns dotted Europe for generations, serving as monuments to the famine years. Some were eventually resettled, but many became permanent reminders of how quickly civilization could collapse. Real estate values plummeted when the previous owners had become dinner instead of moving out. European folklore began incorporating new stories about child-eating monsters and cannibalistic witches. These tales probably originated during the famine years, but were disguised as traditional fairy stories. The cultural memory lived on in entertainment even when official records tried to forget. The Great Famine taught medieval Europe that civilization was much more fragile than anyone had imagined, and the lessons learned would influence how communities prepared for future disasters.